What we're looking at here is a 3D model of the human brain. Okay, so I'm going to turn this around so that we can see more a cutaway, right? And there's sort of a three main division points we tend to talk about when we're talking about the brain. We have what's called the hind brain, which is down here, right? Which is some of the most ancestral parts of the brain, some of the earliest to evolve. It tends to regulate a lot of the autonomic nervous system, right? It can do a little bit more than that, but the heart of the autonomic nervous system tends to be in the hindbrain, things that we're not always cognitively aware of. The midbrain is an area that's evolved somewhat later than the hindbrain and is in a more evolved species, particularly in the mammal line. It tends to be involved in processing auditory visual information. It's also heavily involved in learning and regulating, particularly in response to reward and consequence, and is heavily involved in memory and navigation. And then the last part is the forebrain, which often is what people think of when they think of the brain. That's the folded tissue here, the gyri and sulci of the brain. And this is the most derived part, evolutionarily speaking, and contains some of the higher order functions. So we'll process auditory and visual and sensory information. It tends to integrate it and help formulate our model of the world, and it is also the heart of our decision making and executive function. So we're going to step through each of these regions and talk about some of the important elements of it. And we're going to start by zooming in here on the hindbrain. Here, let's see, to the medulla oblongata, or usually referred to now as just the medulla. So the medulla is this section here, which over the spinal cord would be attaching here, and the medulla actually has a somewhat bony structure to it, but it is brain tissue. So it's kind of a transition from the bony spinal cord to the tissue-based brain, right? And it is the brain stem and tends to be the heart of the autonomic nervous system. This is something that regulates all of those things that we don't have to think about, and it's a good thing, right? If I had to keep track of keeping my heart going, I would be dead. I'd see something shiny and go, oh, what's that? And I would quickly forget to keep my heart beating, and then game over, I'm dead, right? Don't have to worry about that because the medulla keeps everything functioning. This has some pretty incredible consequences, though, which is that if the medulla is damaged at all, even if no other part of the body or brain is damaged, damage to the medulla usually means instantaneous death. The body stops functioning right away. On the other hand, the whole rest of the brain can be destroyed, liquefied. If the medulla remains intact, the body can continue to function. Right? The heartbeat, the lungs, even digestion can occur. Right? Now this becomes particularly problematic in the modern medical fields because we have now entered a period where we can keep people alive or bring them back from the point of death more than we ever have in history. And more and more and more, we wind up with situations where it's difficult to define what death is. Prior to modern definitions, death usually centered around organ function, particularly the lungs and the heart. If someone was not breathing and the heart was not pumping, they were considered dead. We can now bring people back from the brink of death whose lungs and heart have not been functioning for minutes at a time. So we need a new way to define death. And a huge focus on that has turned to defining death as brain function, or what we call brain death. There are many ways of testing this in a hospital setting. For example, people's reaction to light. When you shine the light directly in somebody's eyes, you expect the pupils to contract. You can look at pain response. You can look at suction, coughing, and gag responses. Some very common ones are, for example, the doll eye, which is where if you turn somebody's head, their eyes will actually turn in the opposite direction as they try to maintain their focus. Somebody who's brain dead develops what's called doll eyes, which means the eyes just flick back and forth as you turn the head. There's also the cold caloric response, which is where you put near freezing water into somebody's ear and you'll get a pupillary response as the person will look towards that stimulus. Right? These are all signs that the brain is functioning at least some level. If you don't get that response, the person may be brain dead. Neuroimaging can also be important. This is what we're looking at here is an angiogram where we're looking at the blood flow to the brain. And we can see here in various examples when there isn't blood flow, the person likely has brain death. We can look at the respiratory response. What you're looking for is both an influx of oxygen and an outflow of carbon dioxide. If we don't get this inflow and outflow pattern, this is usually a sign of brain death. You could also look at things like EEGs, where if there isn't electrical function in the brain, the person is likely brain dead. This is particularly interesting with circulation. Here is an example of a healthy patient with normal circulation. Brain death, you see it's all black. Right? Where things get interesting is, for example, with catarrh patients. Catarrh patients are people who believe they are dead. They fervently believe that they have passed away, that they are no longer alive. They might spend exorbitant amounts of time in cemeteries. They may stop eating or drinking and may do self-harm. They fervently believe that they are not alive. And when you look at the metabolic processes of the brain, in normal healthy controls, there's a lot of metabolic processes going on. And these catarrh patients, they have the metabolic levels of people who we would normally expect are brain dead. But these are people who are up walking around and talking and interacting and seem perfectly normal except for the fact that they think they're dead. And when you look at their brain does look dead. All right? So there's a lot of unknowns that go into trying to define what it means to be brain dead. But it becomes vitally important because brain death is what allows for organ donation. Because once somebody has died and oxygen and blood flow stops flowing to the organs, they can go necrotic. And you cannot give organs that have necrotic tissue, which means the best organs to harvest are in people who are still, their body is still functioning, but their brain has stopped working. You don't want to start harvesting the organs of people who are still alive. Hopefully we can all agree to that. But at the same time, then, if we have to wait for the body to stop functioning, you risk the healthy tissue of the organs. So if we can find a way to declare somebody brain dead, and they're not coming back, but the body still functions, and that's where we get that issue with the medulla. If the medulla remains intact, the body can survive, but the brain has ceased function. They are brain dead. In that case, we often will harvest organs. Where things become complicated is when the medulla remains intact, but the brain is destroyed, and loved ones either disagree with each other or the hospital on how to proceed. One of the most famous cases of this was Terry Schiavo, who was a woman who had a brain aneurysm. She was declared brain dead, but her medulla remained intact, and she was able to continue to survive. As long as she received food and water, her body was kept alive. Her husband said she would not want to be kept alive in this situation. Her parents disagreed, and there was a contracted court battle throughout Florida that took many, many years to resolve before the courts finally ceased food and water, and she passed away 7 days later from dehydration and starvation. There are plenty of cases of this, though, and they will become more and more frequent as medical ability to resuscitate patients gets better and better. For example, Marlise Muniz and Robin Benson both suffered from brain aneurysms, were declared brain dead, but both of them were pregnant at the time. The medulla remained intact, the body kept going, and therefore the pregnancy could continue. In Marlise Muniz's case, the baby was still very young and was likely not viable, but because of an ill-guided law that was established in Texas, hospitals were not allowed to take any medical steps that would risk the life of the fetus, even though the fetus was inviable. And even though her husband, everybody wanted to stop the machines, remove the feeding tube, and let the body die. Right? Instead, Texas pretty much turned her into an incubator, keeping the body alive, trying to grow this baby, till a court ordered and said, no, we're not going to let this continue, and she was allowed to die. However, in the case of Robin Benson, she was far enough along in the pregnancy, and the husband wanted the baby to survive, that they were able to keep her body alive long enough to perform a C-section and save the baby. Even more recently, we had the case of Jahi McMath, who was a young 13-year-old girl who went in for a tonsillectomy, and in the recovery room, her stitches came undone. She bled out into her throat, and by the time they stabilized her, she was unfortunately declared brain dead. However, the medulla remained intact, and the family disagreed with her diagnosis of brain death. The hospital actually released her to a coroner who issued a death certificate declaring her dead, and they took the body out to the East Coast, where a group, again, kept her alive for almost 8 years until she finally passed away, maybe a second time. The family is now currently suing California to have the original death certificate rescinded and her to be declared dead only in the most recent case. And this is something that's being fought in the legal realm. Right? So there's a lot of complexities that can emerge from this medulla as it interacts with the autonomic nervous system. So still centered here in the brainstem, as we move up the hindbrain, we reach the zone here called the pons. The pons brings in sensory information and motor responses, particularly reflexes, and helps coordinate them. In fact, there was a fascinating study that was done by looking at the pons and the cerebellum, which is over here, which is also part of the hindbrain. And what they did is they took a rabbit, and they would show the rabbit a red light, and then they would hit it with an air puff right in the eyes and cause it to flinch. And they do this over and over and over again. They recorded the cellular activity in the pons and the cerebellum, and then went back to another rabbit, and all they did is electrically activate the pons and the cerebellum in the same locations. They never did the light and air puff experiment with that rabbit. All they did was electrically activate those regions, and then they showed the rabbit the red light, and it actually flinched. They're actually able to transport the experience of the first rabbit into the brain of the second rabbit. The cerebellum are these two nodules here, incredibly dense nodules that contain actually the same number of neurons as the whole forebrain, all condensed into the left and right cerebellum nodules. It is thought that this helps control voluntary motor responses, such as catching, running, anything that requires integrating environment and muscle responses. It also seems to be very important in regulating sensory information as well as learning and memory. So a lot of responses going here in the hindbrain. Okay, so that's some of the major components of the hindbrain.